Quintus Fabius Maximus Rullianus, 5-time consul, master of horse 325 BCE, dictator 315 BCE, censor 304 BCE. One of the most decorated Romans in the history of the Republic, this member of the Fabii family held high office on a fairly consistent basis over the course of 30 years. The fact that his career comes to us from Livy by way of the historian Fabius Pictor, a family member, has caused many scholars to be suspicious of the details of Rullianus's career. There are a somewhat suspect number of parallels with the career of his famous great-grandson Fabius Maximus Cunctator from the Second Punic War, which suggest some of the details of Rullianus's honors may have been retconned into the historical record for the honor and glory of the Fabii. Nonetheless, there are no known ancient objections to the claims of the Fabii regarding the deeds of Fabius Rullianus, so let us suspend disbelief and explore the career of this figure who played a key role in extending Roman dominion over all of peninsular Italy. One other thing that I would add before we go further is that there are several Roman figures from the late 4th century who held multiple consulships and served as dictator, so it's not quite as inherently implausible as it may seem at first blush. Fabius Rullianus first appeared in the historical record serving as Magister Equitum, the master of horse, to the dictator Lucius Papirius Cursor in the year 325. While dictators were typically only appointed in times of great stress, it appears that the practice was far more frequent during the late 4th century than it was a century later, when our evidence is much more abundant. While it would seem that older senior senators typically served as the master of horse, Livy explicitly mentions that Fabius was at this time a young man, and that makes a great deal of sense when we consider that he was still active as a field commander 3 decades later. The Roman army under Papirius was encamped in Samnium near a major Samnite army, and Papirius sought the favor of the gods through sacrifice. Papirius's haruspices advised him to go to Rome to sacrifice again after he failed to receive favorable auspices. Leaving Fabius Rullianus in charge, Papirius gave him clear instructions to avoid battle until he returned to resume command. While Papirius was still away from camp, Fabius's scouts reported that the Samnites were not on alert and did not seem to take the Roman threat seriously. Fabius Rullianus, ignoring his orders, mobilized his army and took the Samnites by surprise, forcing a pitched battle at Imbrinium. This battle was hard fought as the cavalry commander Lucius Comnenus had to resort to the unusual measure of having his men charge the Samnite infantry twice, but resulted in a great victory for the Romans. At the end of the day, Fabius Rullianus had won a great victory at Imbrinium, and left 20,000 slain Samnites on the field. This victory, despite its magnitude, was not pleasing to Papirius. Angry that Fabius Rullianus had violated his orders, Papirius was bent on humiliating and punishing his master of horse. Livy's sources were divided as to whether Fabius had fought 1 or 2 battles in Papirius's absence. The degree of Papirius's anger seems to imply 2, although Livy himself thought that there was only a single battle. The fact that Fabius had sent a messenger announcing the victory to the Senate rather than to the dictator was another source of irritation and may have been the thing which really offended Papirius's delicate aristocratic sensibilities. Knowing that he was in trouble, Fabius implored his soldiers to defend him as he anxiously awaited the dictator's return to camp. When Papirius arrived, he held an assembly, denounced the actions of Fabius, and was on the verge of removing him from office when Fabius successfully appealed to his men to protest on his behalf. Losing control of the meeting, Papirius decided to try again the next day. Knowing that the dictator's mind was made, Fabius slipped out of the camp and hastened back to Rome. When he arrived in Rome, Fabius Rullianus, on the advice of his father, who had been a 3-time consul and a dictator, convened the Senate and began to defend his conduct. As he spoke, a very peeved Papirius appeared, and was determined to put Fabius to death for his actions. Only a bold stand by Fabius Rullianus's elderly father and many other senators assuaged Papirius's wrath. Thus, rather than dying for his actions, Fabius Rullianus lived, and had gained the esteem and support of his peers. While Papirius permitted Fabius to retain his office as master of horse, he ordered him to remain in Rome. Back in Samnium, the Roman troops squared off in a decisive battle against the Samnites, and initially lost, as the troops were not motivated to fight on behalf of a dictator whose jealousy of Fabius had discredited him in their eyes. Only after showing a great deal of concern for his wounded troops and offering a generous distribution of booty did Papirius restore his standing and inspire his troops to deliver another major attack and deliver victory for the Roman cause. Thus, even in his absence, the new hero, Fabius Rullianus, was able to exercise a great deal of influence. While Fabius Rullianus' tenure as Master of Horse was undoubtedly the most colorful incident of his career, and he would never again face a political adversary so formidable as Papirius, he went on to achieve even greater fame in his subsequent assignments. In 322, Fabius held his first consulship, the details of which are unknown. In 315, the Senate appointed Fabius dictator, and once again he faced off against the Samnites. As dictator, he succeeded in laying siege to Saticola. After that, Fabius led one of Rome's 3 major armies. During his dictatorship, Fabius apparently approved of a strategy whereby Rome attempted to sustain 3 major field armies at once, which harmed the quality of the armies, especially the one under his personal command, which Livy tells us was largely composed of untested levies. Interestingly, one of the consuls commanding in the field during Fabius's dictatorship was none other than his old rival Lucius Papirius Cursor. The other consul, Publilius Philo, was either defeated by or lost track of a Samnite army which began to ravage Campania. It fell to Fabius to intercept and defeat this force, and he caught up with the invading army at Lautulae. Unfortunately for Fabius, he was decisively defeated by the Samnites. When combined with the defeat suffered at the Chaldean Forks in 321, Fabius's failure at Lautulae marked the low point of Roman fortunes in their struggle against the Samnites, and in the intermediate aftermath of his defeat, the Romans lost territory and had recently conquered allies throw off the Roman yoke. Rome, of course, did recover, and in time the tide turned in Rome's favor. As for Fabius himself, despite the magnitude of his defeat at Lautulae, his personal prestige remained high. Diodorus Siculus records that he served for dictator a second time in 313, but that is not attested elsewhere. In 310, Fabius Rullianus was elected consul for the second time and campaigned against the Etruscans. He won a pair of victories, first at Sutrium and then in a follow-up battle in the Ciminian Forest. He was elected to a third consulship in 308, and he was responsible for capturing Perugia, one of the 12 major cities of the Etruscan Federation, and Nuceria Alphaterna and Campania. In 304, Fabius served as censor. Normally, the censorship tends to be the last known office of most Romans, but Fabius Rullianus was far from typical. In 297, in the midst of yet another major conflict with the Samnites, Fabius was elected to his 4th term as consul and took the field with one of the armies that invaded Samnium that year. Assisted by his able deputy, the ex-consul Scipio Barbatus, Fabius won a major victory at Tifernum by tricking the enemy into believing that the other consular army had arrived on the scene by sending some of his troops around a hill into the enemy army's rear. In 295, Fabius Rullianus was elected unanimously to his 5th and final consulship. At this time, the Third Samnite War was reaching its climax, as the Samnites were now at the head of a vast anti-Roman alliance, which included the Etruscans, Umbrians, and Gauls. Prior to his election, Fabius had demanded and received a concession that his consular colleague would be his former colleague as censor, Publius Decius Mus, an experienced and brave leader of men. The two consuls commanded an army of 40,000 men, and they set out against the Samnites. Fabius and Mus faced off with a Samnite army at Sentinum, and the stakes could not have been higher. This new coalition that the Samnites had assembled was truly dangerous. Fabius's own dictatorship in 315 showed the danger of trying to fight on too many fronts at once. What the Romans needed was a decisive victory on one of the fronts to knock out some parts of the coalition, and that is just what Fabius and Mus intended to deliver. During the battle, Fabius commanded on the right, and Mus led the left wing. While Mus's tactics were more aggressive, Fabius was a bit more reserved. Fabius eventually managed to isolate and destroy the Sinon-Gaul contingent and carry the day, even though Mus's sacrifice in battle was the most famous action on the day. Sentinum was a milestone battle as it resulted in 20,000 Samnite casualties and the breakup of the Samnite coalition at the cost of some 8,700 Roman losses. After 295, the Romans would not face such a grave threat in peninsular Italy again until Hannibal's invasion. 3 years after his signal achievement, Fabius Rullianus would serve Rome one last time. His son, Quintus Fabius Maximus Cunctator, had risen to the consulship in 392 and had initially suffered an embarrassing defeat at the hands of the Samnites as the Third Samnite War dragged on. The enemies of the Fabii called the younger Fabius incompetent and called for his dismissal, but Fabius Rullianus stood by his son, urged the Senate to give him another chance, and declared that he would serve under his son. The Senate accepted, and the old man joined his son's army. The younger Fabius quickly redeemed himself with Rullianus's guidance, capturing several Samnite towns and finally defeating and capturing the Samnite leader Pontius, who had been responsible for the humiliation at the Chaldean Forks in 321. When Fabius Cunctator celebrated his triumph for this deed, Fabius Rullianus rode beside him. Having achieved everything that a Roman aristocrat could ever dream of, and having seen his son evolve from youthful excess to consul and triumphator, Fabius Rullianus passed away the following year in 291.